The Articles of Confederation had no chief executive in some ways because it didn't need one. The Congress, under the Articles of Confederation, had all the power. And as a consequence, and all the power was not much power at all anyway. So as a consequence, you didn't really need anybody to serve as chief executive under the Articles of Confederation. You may have needed a couple folks to try to implement policy, but no one to serve as a president. The Constitution requires a president in part for a bifurcated reason. One is the federal government now has a lot more power than it had under the Articles of Confederation. And it actually was assumed that the federal government would do stuff. Well, if the federal government is going to do something, somebody needs to be there and needs to be available in order to do those things. That is the chief executive, and that's why all of a sudden you need a chief executive. It's not just that Madison wanted to put in a chief executive, it's that there needed to be somebody, an energetic executive, as folks say, to be there to serve in order to move the country forward.
The executive office was the one that presented the most challenges for the framers. And that's because they didn't want to follow the British model on this. They didn't want a king in America. But they had made the executive so weak under the Articles of Confederation, and that didn't work, that they knew they had to strengthen the executive significantly. He had to be commander-in-chief. He had to be chief ceremonial officer, appoint a cabinet, take part in legislation through the executive veto, and various things like that. Now, the dangerous part, of course, is commander-in-chief and commanding the military force, and that was worrisome. But the founders knew that the first president would be George Washington. And so that relieved the fears of many of them, and they were able to go ahead because General Washington was probably the most beloved of all of the Americans at the time.
The idea of a stronger executive was widely held, but it was held in very different ways. So people like Hamilton, who is really at the extreme in this era, really wanted someone quite close to a king, someone with great powers. And he thought that was the way to get things done and that wise people would be put in that position. Others simply thought we were dealing with a vacuum at the top of the government now, and that needed to be filled, but not too far. So, although there was a consensus that the executive needed to be created with some powers, there was not a good consensus on what it should look like. And that shouldn't surprise us, because in this time, there weren't any good models. The world mostly had kings. The notion of a head of government who was subject to popular control, who was answerable to the legislature in some ways, was a very new idea.
In the Declaration of Independence, of course, Jefferson cites many, many failings of King George III and essentially calls him a tyrant. And so the Americans are very fearful of tyranny, and they're fearful of monarchy as well because they think that that obviously can lead to a tyrannical government. They were men very proud and jealous of their freedom. They wanted a vigilance in government, that they themselves were capable of governing themselves, and they stood for that. And so these are people who were willing to spill blood for the cause of liberty, that they gave their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor to this cause. And so there was no fooling around when it came to creating a constitution that would do everything possible to prevent the possibility of tyranny.
For the framers, they, of course, had reacted against the tyranny of George III of England, or what they termed tyranny, but they also feared the tyranny of the mob. They were not sort of small d Democrats in the way that we think of ourselves today. So they were very consciously seeking a middle way. Madison worried a great deal that previous republics had veered either towards the despotism of a single person or to the tyranny of a mob.